All right, Steph, go ahead.
So I'm here to update a little bit about the EAN, the Educational Access Network. I know most of you know what it is, but I'll go through a 30-second recap of sort of what it is and how it came about. The EAN is educational high-speed broadband throughout the Upper Peninsula. And this project, we're really solving a national infrastructure problem that no one else has solved before. And the idea was to simply expand it so that our students could go to their deer camps or wherever and still have access to the university. And so we petitioned the FCC for spectrum, which is a big part of the puzzle, and they hadn't been handing out spectrum because universities were reselling it and misusing it, and so they stopped doing it. And for some reason, we had some genius people at the university who convinced the FCC to give us spectrum for this WiMAX program. We used it in exactly the ways that the feds had intended, and so it worked wonderfully. And then we thought in about 2015, what about if we expanded this? In 2011, President Obama came in, and we all remember that, and part of the reason that he was here was because of the WiMAX program. And so in 2015, we thought, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Why don't we try to offer this to all residents with a connection to education in the UP? And the FCC was so impressed with the way we rolled out the WiMAX program some years before, they granted us additional spectrum to do that in additional service areas. And they wanted 8 service areas throughout the UP covered within 3 years, and we accomplished that in 18 months. And we keep expanding. Right now, excuse me, we're in 87 towns and cities throughout the Upper Peninsula. We pretty much have it blanketed. You can't go into the middle of the scenic stretch and get wireless there. There are more deer than people out there. And we're using a lot of local businesses to build this out in terms of the electrical backhaul or in terms of tower modifications, climbing up towers and installing equipment. We're using local businesses to do that work. We now have 5,000 subscribers in the EAN throughout the Upper Peninsula. About 2/3 of them are connected to a K-12 district. We run it through the service through REMC for our child protection services, so that if you're connected with a K-12 school, we run it through all the filters that a school district would have to run the information through. We're having an impact not only on learning, but on the quality of life for the people that we serve. And some of you have heard these stories before. We have a local story of a family who had to go to the local McDonald's in Harvey every day so their kids could sit and do their homework because they need access to the internet, right? And they were driving in 15 to 20 miles each way every day to do this, and then sitting in the McDonald's with their kids as they finished their homework. Another story in the UP, the family would send the kids to the grandparents' house during the week because the grandparents had internet access and the immediate family didn't. So we are having a really strong impact. We're also using it at the university for our credit educational programs, which is going to impact the economy and allow students from wherever they are to get an education and stay in touch with the university. And Stephanie Zadroga-Langloy, who's our Director of Continuing Education and Workforce Development, we've just finished a rollout of our Cybersecurity Institute, which is non-credit offerings. That's going to heavily involve the EAN, and we're hoping that through the trainings in cybersecurity, both academic programs and non-credit programs, that we can build out an ecosystem of cybersecurity in the area that will allow even high school students, but if not high school students, university students, NMU graduates, and career changers to be able to stay in the local area and contribute to the local economy while working in the cybersecurity space.
Could you talk a little bit about spectrum and what that is?
Sure. So it's sort of like the dial on your radio, right? That all wireless signals have a particular spectrum, right? And the spectrum is divided depending on what kind of institution you are. So there's a for-profit spectrum that's only for for-profit entities to use the internet, and then there's an educational spectrum. So it's kind of like a frequency, right? And so they had a particular frequency set aside for education, as I said, but educational institutions were misusing them and selling them to the for-profit sector. So that That's, again, a big piece of the pie is considering, getting the feds to consider giving you some of that frequency in the spectrum.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting what a competitive disadvantage it is for businesses to not have high speed. They're just out of it. It's so difficult, so not just the educational sector. Okay, thanks, I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
I wonder, are there any questions in particular, because we have to leave early, I wonder if there are any questions in particular related to the EAN that we might catch before you leave? Anything embarrassing you want to ask?
Yeah, hold those thoughts for a while.
We don't have that kind of time. All right, Scott, if you would like to go, next,
Sure.
thank you.
Of course, there's so many things I can touch on the airports. I thought I'd kind of give a little bit of a progression, and I think it touches on several components of what we're dealing with today, and that's the economic importance of the airport as well as the infrastructure aspect. Just a friendly reminder, we just surpassed 20 years at the new location at KI Sawyer. For those that have been here longer, Gar's newer here, but may have known that we had the airport in Marquette, or Negaunee Township, up until September of 1999 when we moved out to KI Sawyer. The reason the board did that back then was obviously the KI Sawyer Air Force Base had shut down, and there was obviously real concerns about what was going to happen economically here. So the board made a difficult decision, which was actually quite controversial at the time, to do that for a couple of reasons. Actually, there's three that I'll touch on right now. One was to help redevelop the Air Force Base so that we could bring new economies back to the community. Secondly, another one was the opportunities that the airport would probably see. If those of you remember, the location at the old site was quite small and limited, and actually pretty dangerous at times to come flying into, depending on which runway you were going to hit on that. They were short, there were rock bluffs right next to it, and not a lot of room to work with on bad weather. And very limited on what you could do with the development side of it, because airports are dependent on several streams of revenue, and tenants are one of those. And I think almost one of the more important components of why we moved out there, some might also remember a company called Ramsey. Am I hitting it right, Amy? Which is now what's called Envoy. They had over 100 employees at that time. They were a maintenance, repair, and overhaul facility that needed larger hangars. And had the Air Force Base not closed and those hangars become available, they wouldn't have had an opportunity to stay around. So as a result of that move to the airport, Ramsey moved out to KI Sawyer, and it's now become Envoy, and they have over 200 employees there. So the impact that they've had on an economic level over that past 20 years is pretty significant. Their payroll today is anywhere between 12 and 14 million a year, just on a payroll standpoint. So, and retaining quality jobs. So those are some key reasons why we moved out there. Another thing that we did acquire, which was a pretty substantial asset. If you think of how the Air Force and the federal government do things, they spend a lot of money on stuff and oftentimes overbuild, and that was also the case out at KI Sawyer. You know, the heavy aircraft they have out there we're landing, the depth and thickness of some of that runway is 2 and 3 feet in some spots. So you're not going to see that in your traditional newly built airport. So you picked up a really wonderful asset. At that time, it was the longest runway in the state of Michigan. Again, providing us hopefully opportunities economically as a community, as an airport, to grow the facility, bring in jobs. A lot of people talk cargo. That didn't work out. There were other things that we've been pursuing over those years. Unfortunately, the runway per the FAA standards now, they moved us down from 12,300 feet to just over 9,000, but that's really not that big of a limitation for us. We can still land most aircraft there. Other things we acquired when we picked this up was a substantial fleet of equipment to operate the facility. Many runway plows and blowers to help accommodate what we already have. So without those pieces of equipment, which we still have in use today, some go back to 1959 and they're workhorses. So without that fleet of vehicles, we rival any community with equipment. And so we're very able to manage our snow removal in the wintertime, which I'll touch on a little bit as well. The other thing that we picked up, which is no one can compare to what we have out at Sawyer, which is also another component for economic growth and is the development of the large number and variety of hangars that we have. we have small hangars for, you know, your typical T hangars for small aircraft, on up to hangars that are 34,000 square feet, and believe it or not, those aren't quite big enough for some of the things we need. So having an asset like that is incredible for attracting business. Now, it's taken a lot of time to start filling those, but it's still an asset we have. We've been able to receive substantial funding over the years to help enhance those. All our hangars have been modernized with new insulation, barrier-free requirements, and other aspects that make them more marketable and user-friendly. The old hangars had insulation issues and were a beast to heat, and the sound attenuation in them was horrible, so working in them was not very comfortable. So that was another real positive part of this. So the other thing that we've done, we haven't sat idly since taking on the asset. There's been tens of millions of dollars put into the asset to keep it functioning. We had a wonderful asset that we picked up. There's been substantial work on runways and electrical systems to keep them functioning through bad weather. Lightning strikes out there is very significant, so we've had to work on that. Lightning can take out your runway lights. We've had to work on that over the years. Pavement improvements is a high priority of the FAA, and we continue to work on that, and hence that's why we have the new runway. The main runway probably shouldn't need any substantial work for 15 to 20 years based on the project we completed in 2018. Upcoming projects, what we're looking at is taxiway and apron work, just on your basic maintenance to keep the pavements in good condition. As our hostess will know, that FOD is a bad thing for aircraft. That's the foreign objects that fall on and come out of broken pavements and end up getting sucked into aircraft engines. That can be a problem. So the more you got to work on your pavements. Something that's very important to us, that's a big project because which I'll talk on briefly, some numbers. Our secure area, anybody who's flown out of Sawyer knows that there's barely enough room just to accommodate one aircraft full of people. The seating area in the secure area after you go through the TSA holds about 50 people. We had planes, American was bringing in planes that had over 60 seats. There was standing room only in there. We're working on a project that in the next couple of years we're hoping to expand that to maybe even double the space of that. There are times that we have overlap of flights, and that's even worse. So it's uncomfortable, not enough seating. It's just not a very fun experience for people, and traveling can be stressful to begin with. So that's a project that's coming up. The other thing that we're also doing and have positioned ourselves that no other airport in the Upper Peninsula can do is we're going from a Category 3 to a Category 4 airport. What that means is by being designated as a Category 4 airport, our security levels have to increase, but it allows us on a regularly scheduled basis to have aircraft over 61 seats. So with the reduction of a lot of the 50-seat aircraft that's going to take place at some point, that positions us well for the 70 and 90-seaters that we anticipate in the future will be coming. So no other airport in the UP will have that unless something changes with the FAA rules.
So we have committed to the state of Michigan that we will build a tunnel in the Straits of Mackinac to house the new Line 5 pipeline. So this project is set to achieve a few key goals here. It'll be 100 feet below the lake bed, so that would eliminate the risk for any oil spill in the Straits of Mackinac. It would also eliminate the risk of any third-party damage, as in an anchor strike, which we did see a few years back now. And so this will house the brand new 30-inch Line 5 pipeline and would get the pipelines off of the lake bottom there in the Straits. And then it also opens up the opportunity for other critical energy infrastructure to be housed in the tunnel as well, or communications technologies in the future. And Enbridge is going to bear the $500 million cost to design, engineer, build this tunnel, and then we will also maintain and operate the tunnel. But once it is finished, we will be signing that over to the state of Michigan through a public-private partnership. So the biggest question I get when I'm talking to people about building a tunnel is they ask, well, how are you going to do that? How do you even build a tunnel under the Straits of Mackinac? And I'm sure in this area you're very familiar with the mining industry, and so they're very familiar with the underground industry. But we'll use what's called a tunnel boring machine, or a TBM. They're very, very, very sophisticated pieces of equipment. And every TBM is designed specifically for the geology that they will be mining through. So our TBM is going to be actually built in St. Ignace, which I think is pretty cool because I live in St. Ignace. and it's gonna be built and designed specifically to drill through the Straits of Mackinac. And so they have those cutter heads on the front, which you can see in the left-hand picture there. So that's kind of what's grinding that rock there through the straits. And then on the right, you kind of have what it looks like inside the tunnel boring machine, or what's called the shield. So that's like the brains of that tunnel boring machine, where all the electrical is housed and all of that fun stuff. And then they have a trail behind it, which in very technical terms, as it was described to me, that is what digests and ejects out the back end, the rock and soil, that they will be mining through. So it's kind of a three-part piece of equipment. So I have a couple other fun pictures here. On the bottom left, that is actually our team walking through a very similar utility tunnel. We are admittedly not in the tunneling business, so once we decided to take on this project, we had to start reaching out to other companies who have taken on similar projects and kind of pick their brains on how they went about that. And then on the right are these concrete liners, which will be put up behind the tunnel boring machine to build the tunnel. So that will have a foot thick of concrete liner on the inside. So to chat about a little bit where we are now, the first major step, or I guess the most visible step that you could have seen for us to build this tunnel would be our geotech work. So if anyone had driven across the Mackinac Bridge this summer, you saw a very, very nice big boat out in the straits. Her name was the Highland Eagle. She was there all summer, and through the fall. She actually just left a few weeks ago. She came from the North Sea, and that is where she is back to now. But they were doing our geotechnical borings there. So we did some onshore and then some nearshore work, and then the Highland Eagle was doing that deep water borings in that ancient riverbed there in the straits. So that's kind of a glimpse on what these core boxes look like. It's very interesting to me just because no one's ever done a full survey of the straits like that before. So aside from just what we'll be needing to use for our tunnel project, that actually tells the history of how the straits were created. And so there's a lot of educational facilities that are really interested in getting their hands on those core samples after we're done. But they are currently right now being housed in a warehouse in Sheboygan, where our team is examining them, and that information will go into the design and the engineering of the tunnel. And then this one, which I'm sure some people have seen this picture before, but I just think this is the coolest thing. This is one of the core samples that they took over the summer, and they found like a fossilized worm, which our team has named Iggy, which I feel like is very appropriate for the area. But they estimated that to be 400 million years old, which it's crazy for me to even wrap my head around a rock being pulled out of the straits 400 million years old. So that's kind of where we're at now. We just wrapped up that geotechnical survey, so from there we're going to be moving into the design phase of the tunnel, and we're also getting ready to submit some key permits here in 2020. But we are moving full steam ahead with building this tunnel. We see it as kind of common sense. It's the best path forward, and it just makes sense for the state of Michigan and for securing that energy reliability. And we actually have seen a great outpouring of support, especially from Upper Peninsula counties. So I'd like to show this map here, which actually I can't even keep up. There's a few more counties that have passed resolutions in the northern lower Michigan, but they've all passed resolutions supporting the Great Lakes Tunnel and the continued operation of Line 5. So I think we're up to 15 so far. And that just means the world to us having that support. And we've had a lot of municipalities and townships as well that have passed support. But yeah, that's kind of a quick synopsis of where we're at and where we're going.